"That vintage isn't meant for hands like yours." The words cut through the elegant murmur of the private wine, tasting like a shard of broken crystal. The sommelier's voice carried just enough volume to ensure the surrounding guests could hear, his smirk reflecting in the polished mahogany of the tasting table. 72-year-old Maurice Beaumont's weathered fingers froze mid-reach toward the 1986 Chateau Saint-Michel Bordeaux, a wine he had crafted with those very hands nearly 4 decades ago. The bottle that now commanded $4,600 at auction had once been his life's pride. No one in the room knew. The exclusive wine showcase unfolded in the grand hall of Westerly Estate, where crystal chandeliers cast honeyed light over 30 of California's most prominent wine collectors and investors. Maurice had received his invitation through a former colleague, a rare opportunity to taste his own creation one more time before the remaining bottles disappeared into private collections forever. His worn sports coat and scuffed shoes marked him as an outsider among the tailored suits and designer dresses. The sommelier, Ethan Radcliffe, had been watching him suspiciously since he'd arrived, clearly wondering who had allowed this old man entry. As Maurice slowly withdrew his hand, a ripple of uncomfortable chuckles spread through the nearest group of guests. Heat climbed up his neck as he stared at the familiar label, the vineyard landscape he'd painted himself, the signature he'd designed. Now he couldn't even touch it. In the corner of the room, partially hidden by a stone pillar, a man in a simple black jacket observed the interaction, his eyes narrowing slightly. Johnny Depp swirled the wine in his glass thoughtfully, watching as the old winemaker's dignity was stripped away before a room full of people who could never understand what true craftsmanship meant. Maurice Beaumont stared at the floor, the elegant Italian marble beneath his feet blurring as he fought to maintain his composure. 40 years of tending vines through freezing springs and scorching summers, of hands stained purple during countless harvests, reduced to this moment of humiliation. The 1986 vintage had been miraculous. Perfect weather, perfect grapes, perfect fermentation. The wine in that bottle contained his soul. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable with the refreshments in the sitting room," Ethan suggested loudly, gesturing toward a side door where servers offered water and simple appetizers to the staff and drivers. His voice carried artificial concern, but his eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of establishing hierarchy. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, but none intervened. A woman in diamonds worth more than Maurice's entire life savings whispered something behind her hand to her companion, both glancing at his direction with a mixture of amusement and pity. Maurice felt himself becoming invisible, transforming from a person into an anecdote these people would share later, the old man who didn't know his place. He considered leaving, saving what little dignity remained. Yet something kept him rooted there, perhaps the need to be near his creation one last time, or perhaps simple stubbornness. The vintage represented the pinnacle of his life's work, bottled proof that his existence had mattered in some small way. Johnny Depp detached himself from the pillar where he'd been observing the room. Though invited as a notable collector, his wine cellar was rumored to be extraordinary. He'd maintained a deliberate distance from the evening's social choreography. He moved unhurriedly through the crowd, nodding politely at those who recognized him, but continuing toward the tasting table where Maurice still stood, frozen in his humiliation. Across the room, phones began to appear. The whispers changed from, "Is that really Johnny Depp?" to, "He's coming this way." Social currency in this circle was measured not just in wealth, but in proximity to fame. The sommelier straightened his already impeccable posture, mentally preparing clever wine observations to impress the Hollywood star. Maurice, unaware of the approaching celebrity, finally turned to retreat to the side room as instructed. His shoulders had collapsed inward, his tall frame seeming to shrink under the weight of shame. Behind him, the sommelier had already begun preparing the next pour for more appropriate guests, dismissing the old man from his consciousness. "Excuse me," came a gentle voice at Maurice's elbow. Johnny Depp stood beside him, extending a hand. "I couldn't help overhearing. You worked with Saint Michel wines?" His question carried genuine interest, his eyes reflecting none of the condescension that had dominated the room moments before. Maurice blinked in confusion, first at being addressed, and then at recognizing who stood before him. Yes. Many years ago," he managed, his French accent thickening with emotion. Around them, the room's atmosphere transformed. The sommelier hovered uncertainly between deference to celebrity and commitment to his earlier pronouncement. Guests drifted closer, wine momentarily forgotten as they maneuvered to witness the interaction. "I thought so," Johnny nodded, his eyes crinkling slightly. "There's something about the hands that work with vines. They tell stories." He glanced meaningfully at Maurice's weathered fingers, then at the bottle of Bordeaux, still sitting on the table. "The '86 Saint Michel is legendary. I have 2 bottles in my collection I've been saving for a truly special occasion." The sommelier cleared his throat, recalibrating his approach. "Mr. Depp, we'd be honored to have you sample our rarest selections. Perhaps in the private tasting room." Johnny raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Actually, I'm fascinated by the connection between craftsman and creation. Too often we separate the art from the artist." His gaze returned to Maurice, genuine respect evident in his expression. "I'd consider it a privilege to taste this particular wine alongside someone who knew it from birth." The room fell silent, the power dynamic shifting like tectonic plates beneath their feet. Something extraordinary was unfolding, and everyone knew it. The sommelier's professional smile tightened at the corners. Ethan Radcliffe had spent 15 years cultivating his reputation among California's elite wine circles. He'd studied in France, apprenticed with master sommeliers, and built a network of influential clients who valued his ability to validate their expensive tastes. Now, this unexpected celebrity intervention threatened to undermine his authority. "Mr. Depp, while I appreciate your interest, these tastings follow a specific protocol. Our guests expect a certain standard of expertise." His emphasis on the last word hung in the air, a subtle reminder of Maurice's perceived inadequacy. Johnny's expression remained pleasant, but something flickered behind his eyes, a quiet intensity recognizable to anyone who had seen him transform into his most formidable characters. "I've always found that true expertise often exists outside of official credentials," he replied, his voice carrying easily through the now silent room. "Some of the most extraordinary winemakers I've met never had formal training, just generations of wisdom in their hands." Maurice stood perfectly still, caught between the humiliation of moments before and this unexpected defense. Around them, the audience of wealthy collectors had become entirely focused on the unfolding drama, social media temporarily forgotten as they witnessed something more compelling than any staged photo opportunity. "Perhaps you know wine from the consumer perspective, Mr. Depp," Ethan countered carefully, "but there's a technical aspect to proper evaluation. The nuances of tannin structure, the complexity of the nose, the precision of the finish, these require trained sensibilities." "Is that so?" Johnny turned to Maurice. "And how long did you work with Chateau Saint-Michel, sir?" Before Maurice could answer, a woman in her 50s with an air of authority stepped forward. "Excuse me, but are you Maurice Beaumont?" Her French accent matched his own. "The Maurice Beaumont who was chef de cave at Saint-Michel from 1978 to 1992? A murmur rippled through the crowd. The sommelier's face drained of color. Maurice straightened his posture slightly, years falling away from his bearing. "Oui, madame, I was chef de cave, yes." The pride in his voice emerged like a creature long caged, tentative but alive. The woman extended her hand. "I'm Sophie Laurent, wine journalist for Le Figaro. I've written about your 1986 vintage. It's considered one of the defining Bordeaux wines of the late 20th century." She turned to address the room. Monsieur Beaumont didn't just work at Saint-Michel, he revolutionized their winemaking process. His techniques are now standard practice throughout the region. Phones emerged again, but this time they weren't aimed at Johnny Depp. Guests were discreetly searching Maurice's name, eyes widening as they discovered his significance. The sommelier's complexion had shifted from pale to flushed, his hand repeatedly adjusting his already perfect tie. "I left when the chateau was sold to investors," Maurice explained softly. "They wanted a more modern approach, younger faces. The new owners preferred someone with formal credentials over someone who learned from his father and grandfather." Johnny nodded. "Credentialism over craftsmanship, a story as old as time." He turned to Ethan, whose discomfort was now plainly visible. "Perhaps we could all benefit from hearing Monsieur Beaumont's perspective on this particular vintage. After all, who better to guide us through its complexities than the man who created it?" "I simply meant to maintain our standards," Ethan began, but Johnny cut him off with a raised hand. "I believe what constitutes the standards is exactly what's in question here." His voice remained gentle, but the steel beneath was unmistakable. Several guests nodded in agreement, the balance of the room shifting like wine in a glass. A distinguished older man in an impeccable suit stepped forward. "I would very much appreciate hearing from Monsieur Beaumont. I've had this vintage in my collection for 15 years without truly understanding its history." Others murmured assent, curiosity, and the desire to align with Johnny Depp's position, creating a new consensus. Ethan recognized his rapidly diminishing control of the situation. His expertise, the foundation of his identity in these circles, was being questioned in front of his most valuable clients. "Of course," he said, forcing brightness into his voice. "Perhaps Monsieur Beaumont would like to share an anecdote while I prepare the tasting." It was a strategic retreat, an attempt to relegate Maurice to entertainment rather than authority. Johnny saw through the maneuver immediately. "Actually," he suggested, "perhaps Monsieur Beaumont could lead this particular tasting. I'd be honored to experience this wine through the senses of its creator." The room waited for Ethan's response. The moment stretched, heavy with potential humiliation, not for Maurice this time, but for the sommelier, who had dismissed him. It was a perfect reversal, a narrative of justice that everyone could feel unfolding. Ethan looked around the room, reading the shift in the crowd. These were people who valued proximity to greatness, and suddenly, unexpectedly, greatness wasn't only the Hollywood star in their midst, but also the elderly man in the worn jacket. The sommelier made his calculation and produced a professional smile. "An excellent suggestion, Mr. Depp." He gestured toward the bottle with exaggerated courtesy. "Monsieur Beaumont, would you do us the honor?" Maurice hesitated, decades of being pushed aside making him wary of what might be another humiliation. Johnny moved closer to him, speaking quietly. "Some creations are never truly finished, even decades later. They continue to speak for their creators." The words carried personal understanding. An actor whose performances continued to affect audiences long after filming ended. Something resolved in Maurice's expression. He nodded once and approached the table with dignity, his weathered hands steady as they reached for the bottle that contained his legacy. The room grew silent. Phones were lowered. Even breathing seemed to quiet as Maurice lifted the bottle with reverence, turning it to catch the light, reuniting with his creation after years of separation. "The 1986 vintage," he began, his voice gathering strength, "was born during a summer of miracles." Maurice cradled the bottle with the tenderness of a parent reuniting with a long-lost child. His eyes traced the label he'd designed himself, the watercolor of Saint-Michel's sloping vineyards, the elegant script he'd insisted upon despite the extra cost. He breathed deeply, centering himself in this unexpected moment of redemption. The summer of 1986 began with fear, he said, his accent thickening with memory. April frost had threatened the young buds, and we thought the vintage was cursed. Then came 3 perfect months, warm days, cool nights, just enough rain. The grapes achieved what we call in France l'équilibre parfait, perfect balance. As he spoke, the sommelier silently brought proper glasses, his movements stiff with resentment. Maurice accepted the corkscrew without acknowledging the shift in power, his focus entirely on the bottle in his hands. The room watched, mesmerized, as he carefully cut the foil with practiced precision. The cork, Maurice explained, tells the first story. He twisted the corkscrew with expertise that belied his age, extracting it with a gentle pop that resonated through the silent room. He examined the underside, nodding with satisfaction. Still moist, minimal sediment, the cellar conditions have been excellent. He brought the cork to his nose, closing his eyes momentarily. 38 years, and still it carries the memory of that summer. Johnny Depp observed with genuine respect, while around them phones had transformed into cameras, documenting this unexpected masterclass. The wealthy collectors who had earlier dismissed Maurice now leaned forward, not wanting to miss a word. Even Ethan stood transfixed, despite himself, professional curiosity temporarily overcoming his wounded pride. Maurice poured a small amount into his glass, the ruby liquid catching the light. He swirled gently, his weathered hand moving with surprising grace. "Now," he said quietly, "we see if my child remembers its father." Maurice raised the glass, examining the wine's color and viscosity. "Remarkable clarity," he murmured. "The garnet edge shows mature Bordeaux, but the core still holds its ruby heart." He swirled again, creating a hypnotic whirlpool of crimson, then brought the glass to his nose. The moment he inhaled, his expression transformed. Decades fell away from his face, replaced by an almost spiritual recognition. "Ah," he breathed, "there you are." Johnny noticed the change immediately. "What do you find?" he asked softly, not breaking the spell but deepening it. "Everything," Maurice replied. "The black currant that grew along the eastern slope, the September rain that came just when we needed it, the morning fog that cooled the grapes." His voice grew stronger with each observation. "I can smell the oak barrels. I selected each one personally from forests in central France. 3 years, air-dried medium toast." He took another breath, deeper this time. "And beneath it all, the soil of Saint-Michel, the limestone, the clay, the ancient river stones. This is terroir in its purest form." The room was utterly silent. Even those who had attended hundreds of tastings had never experienced wine described this way, not as a collection of technical notes, but as a living history, a captured moment in time. Sophie Laurent scribbled frantically in her notebook, while several collectors exchanged glances of astonishment. Maurice finally took a small sip, holding the wine in his mouth. His eyes closed, and for a moment his expression became so intensely personal that many guests looked away, feeling they were intruding on something intimate. When he spoke again, his voice had softened. "The tannins have melted like snow in spring. The oak has integrated completely. But the fruit—" He shook his head in wonder. "The fruit still lives, like a memory that refuses to fade." He passed the bottle to Johnny, their eyes meeting in mutual understanding of what it meant to create something that outlived the moment of its creation. Johnny poured his own glass and those of the nearest guests, including Sophie Laurent and the distinguished collector who had first spoken up. Ethan remained motionless at the edge of the group, his expertise rendered momentarily obsolete by something more powerful, the authentic voice of creation itself. "In winemaking," Maurice continued as others began to taste, "we speak often of technique, of science. These things matter, yes, but there is something more. He placed his hand over his heart. The great wines, they are made here first, with love, with respect for what came before you and what will come after. Johnny nodded, swirling his own glass. It's the same in all arts. Technique serves the truth, not the other way around. He sipped the wine thoughtfully. This is extraordinary, like experiencing history in a glass. Around them, expressions of wonder spread across faces more accustomed to calculated appreciation than genuine awe. The distinguished collector closed his eyes after his first taste. "I've owned this wine for 15 years, he admitted, "but I'm only truly tasting it now, through your words, Monsieur Beaumont." Sophie Laurent lifted her glass in a toast. To Maurice Beaumont, whose hands speak the language of the vine better than any certification could teach. Others raised their glasses, echoing her sentiment. Even a few who hadn't received a pour participated in the gesture, caught up in the moment's authenticity. Maurice nodded in acknowledgement, his eyes bright with emotion too complex for words. The sommelier, recognizing both defeat and opportunity, finally stepped forward. "Perhaps, Monsieur Beaumont," he said with careful humility, "you might tell us what to look for in the finish?" It was a professional olive branch, offered publicly. The room waited for Maurice's response, sensing that more than wine appreciation hung in the balance. It was a question of grace in victory, of how circles of inclusion might be redrawn. Maurice studied Ethan for a moment, then smiled slightly. "The finish," he said, "is where the wine tells you its future. Let me show you what to listen for." The tasting extended well beyond its scheduled conclusion, the formal program abandoned as Maurice guided the group through not just the 1986 Bordeaux, but the story of Saint-Michel itself. The collectors, initially drawn by celebrity and exclusivity, found themselves captivated by something far more valuable, authentic passion and generational wisdom. Johnny remained by Maurice's side, occasionally translating a French winemaking term or asking questions that revealed his own considerable knowledge. Their rapport was evident, two artists recognizing in each other a shared understanding of what it meant to create something that carried your soul into the world. Ethan, to his credit, adapted quickly to the evening's unexpected turn. His initial resentment gradually transformed into professional curiosity as he recognized the rare opportunity to learn from a master outside the formal channels of wine education. By the end of the night, he was taking notes, his earlier condescension replaced by genuine questions about techniques long forgotten in modern winemaking. Sophie Laurent had filled an entire notebook, occasionally interrupting to clarify a detail for what was clearly evolving into a major feature article. "This will change how people understand the '86 vintage," she told Maurice. "Your contribution has been overlooked for too long." Maurice smiled, the vindication sweeter than any wine he'd ever created. Within days, photos and videos from the event spread through wine circles and beyond. Sophie's article in Le Figaro, The Forgotten Master of Saint-Michel, was translated into 8 languages, chronicling Maurice's innovations and their lasting impact on Bordeaux winemaking. Auction prices for the 1986 Saint-Michel vintage increased by 30% overnight, with collectors specifically citing Beaumont's original vision in their bids. Johnny Depp's involvement amplified the story's reach beyond the niche world of wine collecting. Entertainment media picked up the tale of how the Hollywood star had recognized what others missed, the quiet dignity of true craftsmanship. In an industry often criticized for superficiality, Depp's genuine appreciation for Maurice's artistry resonated with millions. More significantly, Maurice received 3 consulting offers from boutique California wineries seeking to incorporate traditional methods into their production. At 72, he found himself with a second career his expertise now valued precisely because it wasn't taught in modern enology programs. Sometimes the old ways remain the best ways, he told a wine podcast that interviewed him, not because they are old, but because they were born from observation and respect for the grape, the soil, the weather, not from formulas and textbooks. The sommelier, Ethan Radcliffe, contacted Maurice to apologize privately and request mentorship, a humbling gesture that Maurice accepted with grace. 6 months after that fateful evening, Maurice Beaumont stood among the vines of a small Sonoma vineyard, where he now served as consulting winemaker. The morning fog was lifting, revealing rows of promising young Cabernet just beginning to develop their summer clusters. Beside him stood Johnny Depp, who had flown in specifically to see the operation that Maurice had helped transform. "Do you miss Saint Michel?" Johnny asked, both men gazing across the landscape that so resembled and yet differed from the French countryside of Maurice's youth. "I carry Saint Michel here," Maurice replied, touching his heart. "But these vines, they are my future now." He knelt to examine a cluster, his weathered hands gentle against the young fruit. "They need me to teach them to speak of this place, this soil." Johnny nodded, understanding perfectly. "Creation never really ends, does it? It just changes form." "Exactly so," Maurice agreed, standing again. "What matters is not the name on the bottle or the price at auction. What matters is the truth in the glass, and that comes only from hands that love the work." As they walked between the rows, Maurice explained his plans for the harvest, his eyes bright with purpose renewed. The vintage of his life had not ended after all. It had simply aged into something richer, more complex, and unexpectedly more valuable than before. In the end, true craftsmanship had found its rightful recognition, not in credentials or critic scores, but in the universal language of passion that speaks directly from creator to those who truly wish to understand.